Good evening and welcome to this edition of Africa in Focus with myself, Kwame, Ghanaian broadcaster, writer, journalist, podcaster, and entrepreneur. And in this week's edition of Africa in Focus, we're still looking about tourism in Africa as it approaches the festive season. So we're looking about tourism in Africa. This week, we're looking about Johannesburg, the megacity in South Africa. So that's the city that we're looking at today, Johannesburg in South Africa. So before we get to the podcast, just to make you aware that if you like what you hear, please share to your friends, family, social media networks. Please subscribe to Ghana, Africa in Focus on YouTube. You can subscribe to that as well. And also subscribe to the podcast also on Spotify. Just look out for Ghana, Africa in Focus on Spotify podcasts. Click follow button, meaning that every time I upload a new episode, Spotify will notify you of that. All right, so please subscribe to both YouTube and also Spotify. It costs nothing, it's for free. So please, if you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe to the Ghana Africa in Focus podcast. All right, so let's get into the podcast today, looking about Johannesburg, the African mega city. So Johannesburg is the business financial center of South Africa, and it's one of Africa's mega cities, along with cities like Lagos, Cairo, Abidjan, Nairobi, Luanda, etc. And so Johannesburg is in the Transvaal area of what is called South Africa, and it is a very, very cosmopolitan city as well. And so Johannesburg is definitely a must put on your bucket list if you are planning to visit the continent this festive season. So like I mentioned, we want to promote African tourism because African tourism is the world's best kept secret. And you don't really hear, in your tour guides or in your tour brochures, a lot about African countries. And so we want to dispel the myth that there's nothing to do or see in Africa by exposing, these African megacities. So last week was Accra, week before that it was Nairobi, and this week is Johannesburg, often called Joburg. And I didn't know that Johannesburg was founded upon gold. The world's second biggest gold mine is in Kimberley. Kimberley is just outside Johannesburg. And in the 1700s, there was a massive gold rush in Johannesburg, and many Europeans were attracted to the Johannesburg area because of the discovery of gold. And so Johannesburg itself is actually built on the huge profits and receipts that South Africa made from gold. And you've got things like the gold coin in South Africa, you've got things like the Kruger Rand, etc. And even, the crown jewels that the British royal family wears is actually made partly from South African diamonds and gold. Yeah. So that tells you that South Africa, apart from being Johannesburg, apart from being a beautiful city, is also a very, very minerally wealthy city as well. So as I mentioned, Johannesburg is the business, hub of South Africa, and there's many, many big companies that actually, have their headquarters based in South Africa. Yeah. And like I said, South Africa is one of Africa's mega cities. So it's a population of about just under 5 million. And it's situated, like I said, in the Gauteng province of South Africa. And it's the provincial capital of Gauteng, which, by the way, is the wealthiest province in South Africa. And Johannesburg is also the seat of the Constitutional Court, which is the highest court in South Africa. Yeah. So as I mentioned, most of the major South African companies and banks like Castle Brewery, like FMD Bank, like Asbert, formerly Barclays Bank, a lot of them big South African companies, as well as major global companies, have their HQ in Johannesburg. And so, that alone makes Johannesburg a city worth going to. In actual fact, Johannesburg can compete easily with top European cities like London, Paris, Amsterdam, Rome, Berlin, Brussels, etc. Johannesburg is a very, very beautiful city. In actual fact, there's a lot to see and do in Johannesburg, which we'll talk about as this podcast moves on. But Johannesburg is definitely somewhere I would recommend that you go to on your trip to an African country. Now, Johannesburg, you know, is like I say, very, very cosmopolitan city. And if you look at the sort of racial mix of the city, 75% is African population, 12% is white or European, 5.6% is colored, which is mixed race in South Africa. Population Indian and Asians make about 4.9% of the population of Johannesburg, and then go over people 1%. And so, Johannesburg is a very, very cosmopolitan city with different cultures and different peoples represented in the cities. Now, Johannesburg is great for nightlife, and if you love your nightlife, then Johannesburg is definitely the place to go. Johannesburg is in the top 5 of African cities that have great nightlife. So you definitely want to check out, some nightclubs, particularly in the downtown area of Johannesburg when you visit that country, or that city rather. Also, Johannesburg has got some great, great cuisine, again, like Nairobi and like other many major African megacities. It's a culinary delight. So if you like your food, there's a massive array of international cuisine, like I say, Chinese, Indian, Lebanese, European restaurants, Middle Eastern restaurants in Johannesburg, as well as traditional South African restaurants, which sell things like the world famous biltong. So if you want to sample local South African cuisine like biltong, then you don't want to miss those fantastic, trendy restaurants in Johannesburg. Now, again, Johannesburg is also a very historic city because just outside Johannesburg is the township of Soweto. The township was created obviously by the apartheid era government that created these townships to house the African population. So during the apartheid era, many Africans were not allowed to go to downtown Johannesburg, actually Johannesburg itself, because that was the system of apartheid, which means separate in the Dutch language. And so these settlements, like Soweto, were created for the African population. And so Soweto is a very, very historic city within Johannesburg, or suburb within Johannesburg, because that's where the Soweto uprising took place in 1970s, I think in 1976 to be precise, or 77. And that's when African school children refused to be taught in the Afrikaans, which is the Dutch language of the Dutch so-called Boer community. And African people said that they want to be taught in the African languages, but the apartheid regime at the time wanted to impose the Afrikaans language on them. And many African students, resisted that. And that's what led to the Soweto uprising in 1976. So many of the ANC stalwarts of the past lived in Soweto. So people like Walter Sisulu and Ivor Tambo, who are the founders of the African National Congress, ANC, lived there, as well as people like Nelson Mandela. And I believe that Nelson Mandela's former house in Soweto is still there. So again, I think since he passed away 2013, I think his house in Johannesburg, or Soweto rather, had become some kind of tourist guide. So, even though, they say Johannesburg Soweto is a township and it's rough, I would strongly, recommend that you visit with a very, very good tour guide, the suburb of Soweto, because, like I said, that suburb or township has played a key role in the anti-apartheid struggle and is a key township within the whole story of South Africa and within the whole story of Johannesburg. And so you definitely want to uh, book a trip uh, to Soweto Township and see for yourself, the legacy of apartheid and also how people live in that part of Johannesburg. Now, on that, you know, on the flip side of that, so you got, a suburb like or a settlement or a township like Soweto, which in part still has worth a bit, but it's plagued by a lot of poverty, etc. On the flip side of that, Johannesburg has some of the richest real estate in Africa. Yeah, we're talking about places like Stanton, Melrose Arch, Ramburg. Oh my God! Now, if you've never been to Johannesburg, right, you definitely need to go to these places I mentioned: Stanton, Randburg, and Melrose Arch. These are places that can compete easily with Manhattan in New York, can compete with Los Angeles in California, can compete with London in England, can compete with Paris in France. These suburbs I've just mentioned are top notch. You know, suburbs of Johannesburg that are home to some of the richest people, not just in Africa but the world. Yeah, and so these places also have very high end shops, high end restaurants, and also high end accommodation in terms of B&B and hotels, Airbnb and hotels. And so I would definitely recommend that you go to Stanton, Randburg, and Melrose Arch to see where the rich people live in South Africa or Johannesburg rather, and that will see the contrast which apartheid created of somewhere like Stanton and then somewhere like Soweto. And that's not far. It's about 5 miles apart. So between Soweto and Stanton, probably at most 10 miles apart. But it has massive contrasts in terms of wealth, in terms of the inequality that is still evident in South Africa, 30 years after so-called apartheid ended. Which for me, like I said before, apartheid never died. And when you go to when you go to Johannesburg, particularly, you will witness for yourself the massive inequalities between African people and European people. And Johannesburg, is a city that actually, you know, uh, strikes those massive inequalities between Africans and Europeans. So, like I said, Stanton, Randburg, Melrose Arch are definitely is an example of that obvious wealth, the opulence that is enjoyed by many Europeans who live in Johannesburg. And like I said, there's a lot of high end also shopping malls in Randburg and Stanton in particular. Oh my gosh, they beat anything in Europe and even North America. Stanton, some of the shopping malls in Stanton, particularly. Oh my God! So definitely, you want to check out, those, that part of the city. Again, just outside of Johannesburg, there's a lion and safari park, you know, where you can do a lot of things. In particular, you can go quad biking, you can go mountain biking, and also look at an array of animals, but particularly lions and their cubs that are in that lion and safari park outside Johannesburg. So again, I definitely recommend that if you're into your wildlife, then South Africa is famous for that. But in terms of Johannesburg, I definitely recommend you going to the Lion and Safari Park Sanctuary. Again, when we look at the history of Johannesburg, there's also museums that I recommend you go to that highlight the history of Johannesburg and even Africa as a whole. So the first museum that I recommend that you visit is the Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg. So obviously this is like a history of the system of apartheid that reigned in South Africa for more than 300 years, which was, legally ended in 1994, but it's still there in many forms, particularly economic and social, political. But that museum gives you a stark reminder of how that system was initiated and some of the damaging effects of apartheid, particularly to the African population of Johannesburg and South Africa. So I definitely recommend that you visit the Apartheid Museum on your trip to Johannesburg. Again, you can also visit the uh, Cradle of Music, sorry, the Cradle of Civilization Museum in Johannesburg. Now, that's going to be eye-opening for many of you because a lot of people, right, think that African or civilization began, in the Great Lakes area, where DR Congo is today, the Great Lakes area. But human civilization, began in Southern Africa. So not necessarily South Africa itself, but we're talking about Southern Africa, where you find people like the Sankoi, so-called Bushmen, and those indigenous groups living in today's Southern Africa. And so when you go to this Cradle of Civilization Museum in Johannesburg, you will see even fossils, right? Remains of human fossils that date millions and millions and millions of years ago. Yeah, so that is definitely, somewhere that I'd recommend because it's eye-opening and you learn a lot about the history of humankind and also how humans evolved outside of outside of South Africa. So definitely, recommend that to you in terms of your trip to Johannesburg. Now, in terms of infrastructure, my God, Johannesburg has first-class infrastructure. As you may or may not know, Johannesburg hosted the World Cup, or South Africa hosted the World Cup in 2010, and Johannesburg was one of the cities in South Africa that hosted the games in the World Cup and also hosted the final due to its first-class infrastructure. So getting around and back to Johannesburg is not difficult at all. There's a great bus network that operates in Johannesburg, just like Europe. There's also a fantastic train network that can take you from Johannesburg to Soweto and vice versa, and also to other parts of the city. You got a train service just like Europe. There's also you can take taxis. There's also minibus as well. South Africa also has minibuses, or Johannesburg has minibuses, and you've also got you know the buses. So the bus that we know, like for example in Europe, those kind of buses, again to take you around and about the city to see the great uh infrastructure that Johannesburg has. Johannesburg also has high-rise buildings that you think that you'd be in New York or London or somewhere like that, but no, Johannesburg has a lot of high-rise buildings, particularly the central business district. And like I said, Johannesburg is the nerve center or the business center of South Africa. And so in Johannesburg itself, apart from the central business district, that is home to the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, which is the richest stock exchange in Africa, there's also a lot of, like I said before, many mega companies that operate within the central business district of Johannesburg. And so, going to the central business district is another thing I would recommend on your trip to Johannesburg. There's also the Johannesburg Art Gallery for you art lovers. There's also the Nelson Mandela Bridge, another piece of infrastructure there where you can see the tourist attraction. There's also the Hillbrow Tower and Pont City, which is in Johannesburg. And again, there's also the Brixton Tower, which is like the CNN Tower in Atlanta. So there's a lot to see and do in this African mega city. Okay, so I will leave a couple of videos out there showing you the splendor of Johannesburg, this African mega city that you definitely must go to this festive time. And so this concludes my series looking about tourism in Africa. We've done Nairobi, Accra, and now Johannesburg. In next year, we'll do some more tourism. But for now, this has been Tourism in Africa with myself, Kwame, Ghanaian, broadcaster, journalist, podcaster, and entrepreneur. In next week's edition of Africa in Focus will be doing a special highlighting the year 2024. A lot has happened in the African content this year. And so join me as we look back at a great year 2024. And so I thank you for listening to this edition of Africa in Focus. Please subscribe to Ghana Africa in Focus on YouTube and also on Spotify. So until next week, thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next edition of Africa in Focus.